In the sun-baked town of Rattlesnake Ridge, where the desert wind carried more secrets than sand, they say the quietest man was the most dangerous. That's what the Black Hawk gang would learn on a scorching afternoon in August 1875, when they made the deadly mistake of taunting the wrong bartender. They couldn't have known that the lean figure meticulously polishing glasses behind the bar of the Dusty Spur saloon had more notches on his gun than their entire gang combined, or that their cruel jests would awaken a ghost they thought long buried, the legendary Desert Phantom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows of the Dusty Spur, catching dust motes that danced like tiny stars in the amber light. James "Ghost" Mitchell worked with practiced precision, his movements as measured and deliberate as death itself. 4 years he'd been tending bar here, and in all that time, Sarah Lancaster had never seen him waste a single motion or speak an unnecessary word. "Ghost," Sarah called softly from her position by the ledger, counting the day's earnings. "Have you ever considered taking a day of rest?" Her question earned her the slight upturn of his lips that passed for a smile these days. "And what would I do with rest, Miss Sarah?" His voice was quiet, gentle even, the kind of voice that made most folks lean in closer to hear. It was also the kind of voice that made them underestimate him, which suited Ghost just fine. The saloon was quiet this afternoon, just a handful of regulars seeking shelter from the merciless desert heat. Old Tom Bradley nursed his usual whiskey in the corner, while Doc Wilson leafed through his medical journal at his regular table. The doc glanced up occasionally, his eyes meeting Ghost's in that knowing way they shared. Of all the people in Rattlesnake Ridge, only Doc Wilson knew why Ghost's hands, now so careful with the delicate glassware, had once been feared throughout the New Mexico territory. The peaceful routine was shattered by the jingle of spurs as Deputy Carson burst through the batwing doors, his weathered face creased with concern. "Afternoon, Sarah, Ghost." He nodded to them both, then made his way to the bar. "Got word from Silver Creek. The Black Hawk gang's been spotted heading this way." Ghost's hands didn't pause in their work, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow so brief anyone else might have missed it. Sarah didn't miss much, though. She'd been running the Dusty Spur long enough to read men better than most. "Marcus Black Hawk?" she asked, her voice dropping, though he and his bunch stayed up near the railroad. "Times change," Carson sighed, accepting the coffee Ghost silently placed before him. "They've hit 4 banks in the last month. Latest word says they're moving south, probably looking for easier targets now that the railroad's beefed up security." Doc Wilson had set aside his journal, listening intently. "How many ride with him now, John?" "7 that we know of," the deputy replied. "Black Hawk, the Cruz brothers, Wild Bill Jenkins, and those 3 new ones, mean bunch of youngsters called the Harper Boys. They don't just rob, they make a show of it, like to humiliate folks before they kill them." Ghost's hands finally stilled on the glass he was polishing. For just a moment, his fingers traced an old scar on his right palm, a habit none of them had ever mentioned, but all had noticed. "Rattlesnake Ridge got nothing worth their trouble," Sarah said firmly, as if speaking it would make it true. "They'll pass us by." "Maybe," Carson agreed, but his eyes drifted to Ghost. "Still, it might be wise to send word to Fort Apache, get some extra troops out here just in case." "Takes 2 days for help to arrive from the fort," Ghost spoke softly, resuming his work. "If they're coming, they'll be here sooner than that." The deputy studied him for a long moment. "You seem mighty sure about that." "Just arithmetic, deputy. Nothing more." But his words carried a weight that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Old Tom chose that moment to stumble to his feet, fishing in his pockets for coins. "Reckon I better head home before dark. The clouds rolling in look like trouble." "Just like always, Tom," Sarah smiled, making a note in her ledger as the old man shuffled out. Doc Wilson gathered his things as well. Think I'll do the same. Ghost, don't forget to pick up those medicines I ordered for your headaches. Came in on yesterday's stage. Ghost nodded, though everyone in the room knew he hadn't suffered a headache in all the years they'd known him. It was just one of those little fictions they all maintained, like pretending not to notice how he always kept his right hand free when serving drinks, or how his eyes constantly scanned the room, even when it was empty. As the afternoon deepened, toward evening, Ruby Rose appeared for her nightly performance, her raven hair catching the last rays of sunlight as she sat up near the piano. Her voice, when she began to warm up, was sweet and clear, a touch of beauty in a town that often had too little of it. "Rider coming," Sarah announced from her spot by the window. "Moving fast." Ghost's hands remained steady as he arranged bottles on the shelf, but his stance shifted ever so slightly. To most, he still looked like nothing more than a simple bartender preparing for the evening rush, but Deputy Carson saw how the man's weight had settled on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. The sound of thundering hooves grew louder, then stopped abruptly outside the saloon. The bat-wing doors burst open, revealing a young ranch hand, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "Deputy! Deputy Carson!" he gasped out. "They're coming! The Black Hawk gang! They just—" "Shut up, Silver Creek. Killed the sheriff and half the town. They're headed this way." In the sudden silence that followed, Ghost carefully set down the bottle he was holding. His movements were still measured, still precise, but now they carried an entirely different quality, like a mountain lion uncoiling before a leap. "How far?" Carson demanded. 2 hours, maybe less. They're moving fast. And the ranch hand swallowed hard. "They're killing everyone in their path." Sarah's hand went to her throat. "Mother of mercy." "Get word to everyone," Carson ordered. "Tell them to bar their doors and windows. Nobody on the streets after dark." He turned to Sarah. "Might want to close up early tonight." "No." Ghost's quiet voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Keep the saloon open, just like any other night." They all turned to look at him, but his eyes were fixed on something distant, seeing perhaps not the bottle-lined shelves before him, but something from long ago. "Ghost." Sarah's voice held a question. "Some folks need to learn," he said softly, "that the deadliest rattler's the one you don't hear." Evening crept into Rattlesnake Ridge like a thief, bringing with it an unseasonal chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The dusty spur maintained its usual appearance, but tension hung in the air thick as gun smoke. Ruby Rose's usual. Song seemed more melancholy than ever, her voice carrying notes of warning that everyone felt but nobody mentioned. Deputy Carson had positioned himself by the window, occasionally glancing down the darkening street. The few patrons who remained hunched over their drinks, speaking in whispers, as if afraid their voices might carry beyond the saloon walls. Even old Tom had sobered up enough to notice the change in atmosphere, his rheumy eyes darting between the door and Ghost's steady presence behind the bar. "Riders coming in from the south," Carson announced, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. The saloon fell silent, save for the soft clink of glasses as Ghost continued his work. The riders turned out to be nothing more than traveling, salesmen seeking shelter for the night, but their news brought no comfort. "Passed through Silver Creek this morning," the older of the two men said, hands shaking slightly as he lifted his whiskey. "Never seen anything like it. They didn't just rob the bank. They made examples of anyone who looked at them wrong. Sheriff Henderson—" He trailed off, taking another drink. "What about Sheriff Henderson?" Sarah pressed, though her face suggested she didn't really want to know. "They made him watch while they shot his deputies," the salesman managed. "Then they tied him to his horse and—" He couldn't finish. Doc Wilson, who had returned to the saloon despite the growing danger, spoke up from his corner. "How many dead?" "9 that I counted. Would have been more." But it seems they wanted to leave enough folks alive to spread the word about what happens when you stand up to the Black Hawk gang. Ghost's movements had slowed almost imperceptibly as he listened. To most, he appeared absorbed in his task of inventory, but Sarah noticed how his right hand kept straying to a spot under the bar where she knew a shotgun had hung unused for the past 4 years. The younger salesman, trying to lighten the mood, attempted a joke. "Lucky for us, we've got a deputy here, right? Though I reckon even the law might want to think twice about facing Marcus Blackhawk. They say he's got 32 notches on his gun." A strange sound came from behind the bar, something between a scoff and a sigh. All eyes turned to Ghost, who had paused in his work. "Something funny about that, bartender?" the young man asked, a slight edge to his voice. 32 notches, Ghost said quietly, resuming his task. "Man who needs to count that high isn't much of a gunfighter." The salesman's face reddened. "What would you know about it? You're just a—" "That's enough," Sarah cut in sharply. "Ghost, could you check the cellar? I think we're running low on that Kentucky bourbon." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ghost nodded and moved toward the cellar door. As he passed Doc Wilson's table, the physician spoke in a voice only Ghost could hear. "Your old wound is bothering you?" "Not yet," Ghost replied softly, "but it will be." Ruby Rose struck up another song, this one about a scorpion in a garden, and Deputy Carson moved to the bar. "Sarah, a word." He glanced around before continuing, in a low voice. "You should know I sent a rider to Fort Apache, but even if they send help immediately, they won't get here in time," Sarah finished quietly. She looked toward the cellar door. "John, about Ghost." "Some secrets," the deputy warned, "are best left buried." But secrets, like corpses, had a way of rising to the surface. This became apparent when 3 local cowhands burst into the saloon, their faces pale with fear. Found Mickey Thompson's body out by Dead Man's Wash, one of them reported breathlessly. Shot clean through the head, execution style. His horse was still saddled, hadn't been dead for more than an hour. The news hit the room like a physical blow. Mickey Thompson was just a kid, barely 18, who helped his widowed mother run the general store. "They're closer than we thought," Carson grimaced. "Sarah, maybe now's the time to—" The sound of shattering glass cut through the air as the young salesman dropped his bottle. But it wasn't the noise that silenced the room. It was what followed. From somewhere in the darkness outside came the distant but unmistakable sound of gunfire, followed by screams. Ghost emerged from the cellar, his face impossible to read, but there was something different about him now, something in the way he moved, as if the quiet bartender was slowly falling away like an ill-fitting coat. The sound of distant gunfire echoed again, closer this time. "Deputy," he said, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. "You might want to get these folks home while they still can." Carson studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, everyone out. Head straight home. Bar your doors." He turned to Sarah. "You too." "This is my saloon," she started to protest, but Ghost interrupted. "Please, Miss Sarah, for once, don't argue." Something in his tone made her pause. She'd never heard him speak that way before, like a man who knew exactly what was coming and had seen it all before. As the patrons hurriedly filed out, Doc Wilson lingered. "Need any help?" "Best get your medical bag ready, Doc," Ghost replied, beginning to move bottles from the top shelf to below the bar. "Something tells me you'll need it before morning." The sound of distant gunfire came again, closer this time, accompanied by the wild whoops of men who had left their humanity somewhere in the desert dust. The Black Hawk gang was coming, and with them, the end of peace in Rattlesnake Ridge. As Sarah finally allowed herself to be led out by Deputy Carson, she looked back at Ghost. He stood behind his bar, as he had countless times before, but now she saw what she'd been blind to all these years, the way he held himself, the deliberate precision of his movements, the watchful eyes that missed nothing. This wasn't just a man who'd seen violence. This was a man who had once been violence itself. The Black Hawk gang didn't so much enter Rattlesnake Ridge as they infected it. Their arrival brought a silence that swept through the streets like a dust devil, extinguishing all signs of life. Only the dusty spurs' lights remained bright, a beacon in the growing darkness. Ghost heard them before he saw them, the synchronized rhythm of 7 horses moving at a deliberate pace. Not the hurried gallop of men running from the law, but the confident stride of predators who feared nothing in their path. He kept wiping the same glass, his movements unchanged as the sound of boots and spurs grew louder on the wooden sidewalk outside. The batwing doors exploded inward with unnecessary force. Marcus Blackhawk entered first, a tall man with eyes like frozen steel and a black duster that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the room. His clothes were expensive but spattered with dark stains that wouldn't wash out. Behind him came the Cruz brothers, Miguel and Raphael, moving in perfect synchronization, followed by Wild Bill Jenkins, whose wild appearance belied the calculating gleam in his eyes. The Harper boys, Luke, Matthew and John, brought up the rear, practically vibrating with poorly contained energy. "Well, ain't this cozy?" Blackhawk's voice carried the hint of educated roots gone to seed. "Seems most establishments in this charming town decided to close early. How hospitable of you to stay open for weary travelers." Ghost set down his glass with careful precision. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" "Gentlemen." Wild Bill laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Hear that, Marcus? He called us gentlemen." "Your best whiskey," Blackhawk ordered, dropping into a chair and propping his boots on the table. "Leave the bottle." Ghost reached for the top shelf, his movements measured and deliberate. He could feel their eyes on him, 7 sets of them watching for any sign of fear or resistance. He gave them neither. "You boys aren't from around here," Ghost observed quietly, placing the bottle and glasses on their table. "What gave it away?" Miguel Cruz grinned, his gold tooth catching the lamplight. "The way you carry your guns," Ghost replied, turning back toward the bar. "High on the hip, railroad style. Nobody out here draws from that position." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Blackhawk's eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem to know a lot about guns for a bartender." "Man learns things." Ghost shrugged, resuming his endless glass polishing. Luke Harper, clearly the youngest and most eager to prove himself, drew his pistol with a flourish. "Man learns things, huh? Learn anything about this?" He spun the gun around his finger, showing off. "Learn that's a good way to shoot yourself," Ghost replied without looking up. The gang laughed, all except Blackhawk, who studied Ghost with growing interest. "You got a name, barkeep?" "Ghost." "Just Ghost." Blackhawk nodded slowly, then without warning swept his arm across the table, sending bottles and glasses crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Well, just Ghost." Blackhawk rose, his voice turning ugly. "You know what I think? I think you're lying to me, and I don't like being lied to." Ghost finally looked up, his face impassive. "Bottle was $12. The Harper boys burst out laughing, but Blackhawk silenced them with a look. He approached the bar slowly, like a mountain lion closing in on prey. $12? That's steep for rot-gut whiskey." He reached into his coat and pulled out a coin, flicking it onto the bar. "Here's 2 bits. Buy yourself some manners." Ghost looked at the coin, then back at Blackhawk. "Still owe $11.75. "Wild Bill," Blackhawk said softly. "Show our friend here what we do to mouthy bartenders." Jenkins grinned and started forward, but at that moment the doors swung open again. Deputy Carson stood, framed in the doorway, his badge catching the lamplight. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, calm as Sunday morning. "Might want to reconsider whatever you're thinking." A deputy, Blackhawk's smile widened. In this little dust heap must be our lucky day. Way I hear it, Carson continued, stepping inside. Silver Creek is missing a sheriff and some deputies. You boys wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Can't say that we do, Black Hawk replied, though his smile grew darker. Though I did hear something interesting about Silver Creek. Heard their lawman was a coward, ran and hid while good men died. His hand drifted toward his gun. You're not a coward, are you, deputy? Everything happened at once. Carson's hand dropped to his holster, but Black Hawk was faster. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space. Carson stumbled backward, red blooming across his chest. John! Ghosts. Voice cracked for the first time, genuine emotion breaking through his careful facade. Stay behind the bar, Carson gasped, then crumpled to the floor. Black Hawk holstered his smoking gun. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, teaching some manners to our friend the bartender. Wild Bill moved forward again, cracking his knuckles, but this time something had changed in Ghost's demeanor. His hands had stopped their endless wiping motion, his shoulders had straightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes had taken on a look that made even Jenkins hesitate. Been a long time since I killed a man, Ghost said softly, almost to himself. Promised myself I was done with it. Kill him! Black Hawk ordered, annoyed by the delay. Kill him slowly! Jenkins reached across the bar to grab Ghost's shirt, and that's when everything changed. Ghost's hand moved faster than seemed humanly possible, catching Jenkins' wrist and yanking him forward. There was a sharp crack as Jenkins' face met the solid oak bar. He dropped like a stone, blood pooling beneath his broken nose. Well, well, Black Hawk drawled, though his hand had dropped back to his gun. Looks like our quiet bartender has some fight in him after all. The Cruz brothers spread out, flanking the bar. The Harper boys bounced on their toes, eager for action. But Ghost stood perfectly still now, his eyes fixed on Carson's motionless form. Last chance, he said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't possessed before. Take your friend and ride out. Don't make me break my promise. Black Hawk's laugh was genuine this time. Or what? You'll serve us to death? He drew his gun with lightning speed. I think it's time we... The sound of a shotgun being racked cut through his words. Ghost had produced the weapon from under the bar, its double barrels now pointed squarely at Black Hawk's chest. That's what you had in mind all along, wasn't it? Black Hawk's smile turned cold, hiding a scattergun under the bar. Problem is, old man, you can only kill one of us before the others cut you down. True, Ghost agreed. Then, with deliberate care, he set the shotgun on the bar. That's why I won't be using it. His right hand dropped to his side, where no gun had been visible moments before. But now, somehow, a well-worn Colt gleamed in his grip, as if it had materialized from thin air. Been a while, Ghost said softly, since anyone called me the Desert Phantom. The name fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition across the faces of Black Hawk's gang. Even Jenkins, still groggy from his encounter with the bar, stopped trying to stem his bleeding nose. The Desert Phantom, Luke Harper whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating. That's just a story. They say he died years ago. Stories, Ghost said quietly, his gun unwavering, have a way of coming back to life. Black Hawk's face had lost some of its color, but his arrogant smile remained fixed. I heard of you. They say you killed 40 men in a single year. Say you could shoot a man's gun from his hand at 100 paces in the dark. If I'd killed that many, Ghost replied, I wouldn't have bothered counting. The Cruz brothers exchanged glances, their synchronized movements betraying their nervousness. They had spread out too far, trying to flank the bar, and now found themselves exposed. Boy, Ghost addressed Luke Harper without taking his eyes off Black Hawk. I'm going to give you a chance your friends won't get. You're young enough to learn from mistakes. Walk out now, leave your gun, and don't stop riding till you hit Mexico. Harper looked uncertain, glancing at Black Hawk, who spoke through clenched teeth. You take one step toward that door, boy, and I'll kill you myself." Behind the bar, Ghost shifted his weight slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but it caused all 7 men to flinch. "Last chance, kid. Be smart." For a moment, the young gunslinger seemed to waver. Then his face hardened. "No one calls me kid." His hand dropped to his gun. What happened next was so fast it seemed like a single motion. Harper drew his gun, clearing leather with impressive speed, but Ghost was faster, impossibly faster. His first shot took Harper's gun hand, spinning the weapon away in a spray of blood. His second caught the young man's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. The Cruz brothers drew in perfect unison, their movements mirror images of each other. Ghost's gun seemed to speak twice more without him even looking. In their direction, both brothers stumbled backward, clutching their gun arms, their weapons clattering to the floor. "You've lost your edge, Phantom," Blackhawk sneered, though sweat had broken out on his forehead. "Time was you'd have killed them all." "Still might," Ghost replied calmly. "Depends on what happens next." Wild Bill Jenkins had managed to regain his feet, blood still streaming from his nose. His hand strayed toward his gun. "I wouldn't," Ghost warned. "You're slower than the others, and I've got 1 bullet left." "1 bullet?" Blackhawk laughed, but there was a hysterical edge to it. "Against the 3 of us? Those aren't good odds, old man." "Better than you think." Ghost's eyes flickered to Carson's still form. "John was more than just a deputy to me. He was there that day in Silver Falls when I hung up my guns. Made me promise to stop killing. Made me swear I'd find another way." His voice grew softer. "But he's dead now, and that promise died with him." A movement caught Ghost's eye. Sarah Lancaster stood in the doorway, a rifle in her hands. She had returned, despite his warnings, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. She understood, stepping back into the shadows. "Silver Falls," Blackhawk said slowly, recognition dawning. "That's where you killed Red Hand Roberts and his whole gang. 6 men, they say." 7, Ghost corrected. "People always forget about the look out. And now you," Ghost continued, his eyes locked on Blackhawk. 8. "Bar them," Wild Bill spat blood onto the floor. "How the mighty have fallen." "Man needs peace," Ghost replied. "I found mine here until you brought war to my door." Outside, thunder rumbled as a storm approached, or perhaps it was just the echo of the earlier gunfire. The wounded men groaned softly, but no one moved to help them. "Way I see it," Blackhawk said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone, "we're at a stalemate. You're good, maybe the best there ever was, but you can't watch all of us at once. The minute you turn to shoot one, the other will put you down." "True," Ghost agreed. "If I were still the man who needed to outdraw his enemies." He nodded toward the shotgun still lying on the bar. "But I own a saloon now, and a saloon owner, well, he likes to keep a few surprises under the bar." Blackhawk's eyes widened as he spotted the thin wire running from behind the bar to the shotgun's trigger. Ghost's boot was resting on something. A pedal, probably salvaged from an old piano. "First man to draw," Ghost explained quietly, "gets both barrels, won't even need to aim. After that," he shrugged, "like you said, 1 bullet left." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the wounded had stopped their moaning, sensing the tension building toward its breaking point. "You're bluffing," Matthew Harper growled from his position near the door, but his hand had moved away from his gun. "Maybe," Ghost agreed. "Question is who wants to find out first?" A drop of sweat rolled down Blackhawk's temple. His fingers twitched near his gun, but he didn't draw. The legend of the Desert Phantom had grown over the years, but the reality standing before them was somehow more terrifying than the stories. "We could still work this out," Blackhawk said, forcing a smile. "Way I hear it, you used to ride with some pretty rough men yourself. Maybe we could—" "You shot my friend," Ghost interrupted, his voice colder than anyone in the room had ever. You heard it. There's only one way this works out now. Behind them, Doc Wilson had silently entered through the back door and was checking Carson's pulse. He caught Ghost's eye and gave a slight nod. The deputy was alive, barely. The knowledge seemed to change something in Ghost's demeanor. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of finality. I've spent 4 years serving drinks to good men and bad, listening to their stories, watching their habits, learning how each man draws, how each man thinks. He paused. And you know what I learned? Neither Blackhawk nor the remaining Harper. Brothers answered, but their eyes were fixed on his gun hand. I learned that the quiet ones, Ghost's finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger, are always the most dangerous. You know, Blackhawk said, his voice unnaturally calm, I heard another story about the Desert Phantom. They say you disappeared after Silver Falls because of a woman. That true? Something flickered in Ghost's eyes, a shadow of old pain. Hit a nerve, did I? Blackhawk's smile widened. They say she died. Say you weren't fast enough to save her. Marcus, Wild Bill warned, seeing something change in Ghost's expression. Catherine, Ghost said softly, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. Her name was Catherine. Sarah, still watching from the shadows near the door, saw Ghost's hands tremble slightly, the first sign of emotion he had shown all night. Ah, so it is true, Blackhawk pressed his advantage. The great Desert Phantom, brought low by a woman's death. Tell me, did she die quick, or... The shotgun roared, its double blast deafening in the confined space. Blackhawk and Jenkins dove in opposite directions as splinters exploded from the wall behind where they had been standing. Ghost's boot had pressed the pedal, but he hadn't aimed to kill, only to scatter them. That was your surprise, under the bar, Blackhawk laughed, rolling to his feet. Now what? Now, Ghost said quietly, we do this the old way. His gun seemed to materialize in his hand again, but this time Blackhawk was ready. Both men fired simultaneously. Ghost's bullet took Blackhawk's hat off, while Blackhawk's shot creased Ghost's shoulder, tearing his shirt and drawing blood. First. Blood to me, Blackhawk grinned, but his smile faded as he saw Ghost hadn't even flinched. You know why they called me the Desert Phantom? Ghost asked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. Wasn't for the obvious reasons, wasn't because I was quiet or fast or deadly, though I was all those things. He stepped out from behind the bar for the first time, his movements liquid smooth despite his wound. It was because of what John Carson taught me, back when he was just a young deputy, and I was just another angry kid with a fast gun. Shut up and fight, Blackhawk snarled, but his voice shook slightly. John taught me that a man's shadow is always with him, but you only see it when there's light. Ghost took another step forward. He taught me that every killer, every murderer, every man who thinks his gun makes him important. They all cast shadows too. And if you watch those shadows long enough, his gun barked once more and Jenkins screamed. His hidden derringer, half drawn from his boot, clattered across the floor. Impossible, Jenkins gasped, clutching his bleeding hand. You couldn't have seen... 4 years, Ghost continued, his eyes never leaving Blackhawk. 4 years I've watched men draw their guns in this saloon, watched their shoulders tense, their weight shift, their shadows move across the floor. 1,000 little tells that say when a man's about to kill. Fascinating lesson, Blackhawk sneered, though his face had gone pale. Why did you become a bartender, to study your prey? For the first time, real emotion crept into Ghost's voice. I became a bartender because John showed me there was more to life than killing. He taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by his speed with a gun or the notches on his belt. He taught me about peace. Peace? Blackhawk laughed harshly. Peace is for cowards. Peace, Ghost cut him off, is for men who've seen enough death to know its true cost. John taught me that. Catherine taught me that. And for 4 years, I lived it. Until now. Until now, Blackhawk said softly. Until now, Ghost agreed. Doc Wilson's voice cut through the tension. I've got the bleeding stopped, but he needs proper care, and soon. You hear that? Ghost's voice hardened. The man you shot, the man who taught me everything I know about being human instead of just being a killer, he's still alive, which means my promise to him still holds. Something like hope flickered across Blackhawk's face. So you won't, but here's what John never understood. Ghost continued as if Blackhawk hadn't spoken. Sometimes a man has to break a promise to keep a bigger one. Sometimes peace can only be protected by men willing to do violence. Thunder crashed again, closer now, and rain began to patter against the windows. In that moment, Sarah saw the transformation complete, saw the quiet bartender she'd known for 4 years become something else entirely. The desert phantom no longer seemed like just a legend. I know what you're thinking, Ghost said softly. You're thinking that even if I am who I say I am, it's been 4 years. You're thinking maybe I've lost my edge, gotten soft serving drinks to cowboys and settlers. His gun disappeared into its holster, a holster that somehow seemed more visible now, as if it had always been there, waiting. You're thinking, he continued, that you're still faster than some washed-up legend, that the stories about me were just that, stories. Weren't they? Matthew Harper called from his position near the door, trying to sound brave despite his trembling voice. No, Ghost said simply. They weren't stories. They were warnings. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white. In that frozen moment, Sarah saw them all like figures in a photograph. Blackhawk coiled to strike, Jenkins bleeding on the floor, the Harper brothers at the edges of the room, Doc Wilson working desperately over Carson's still form, and Ghost. Ghost stood like a man who had finally stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. The shadow had returned. Last chance, he said quietly. Surrender. Face the law. Live to see another sunrise. Blackhawk's smile was terrible to behold. You know I won't. No, Ghost agreed, his voice heavy with certainty. You won't. The rain drummed against the saloon windows, nature's own percussion for the deadly dance about to unfold. Lightning flickered again, and in its stark illumination, Ghost's shadow stretched across the floor, long and dark like the reputation that had followed him all these years. Before this goes any further, Ghost said, his voice carrying the weight. Of experience, there's something you should know about watching men die. Blackhawk's eyebrows rose slightly. And what's that? It changes you. Every time. Each death leaves a mark that can't be washed away. Ghost's eyes drifted to the wounded men around the room. That's another thing John taught me. Why did he make me swear to find another way? Touching, Blackhawk sneered, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Is this how the great desert phantom fights now? By talking his enemies to death? No, Ghost replied calmly. This is how he gives them a chance to live. His gaze swept the room as lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark relief. Sarah, still by the door, saw something she'd never witnessed before. Ghost was teaching just as Deputy Carson had once taught him, but his lesson was painted in shades of survival and death. Most men, Ghost continued, think gunfighting is about who can draw fastest, shoot straightest. He shook his head slowly. But it's about reading, about knowing. As if to demonstrate, his hand moved like lightning, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. The bullet knocked Matthew Harper's hidden derringer, this one from his sleeve, across the floor before the man could fully produce it. Like knowing when a man's about to do something stupid, Ghost added quietly. Harper cursed, clutching his newly bleeding hand. Wild Bill pressed himself further against the wall, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. You've been watching us, Blackhawk realized aloud. All this time we've been talking, reading us like you said. 4 years serving drinks. Ghost nodded. You learn to read men, the way they stand, the way they breathe, the way their eyes move. His voice took on an instructor's tone, like how your right foot turns out slightly before you draw, or how Jenkins' left eye twitches when he's about to try something foolish. Blackhawk's face darkened. You think knowing our tells makes you invincible? No, Ghost replied, but to prove his point, his gun disappeared into its holster again. He turned his back on Blackhawk, walking to the bar with measured steps. Behind him, Blackhawk's hand darted toward his gun. I wouldn't, Ghost said without turning. Your weight on your back foot. You'd miss it. Blackhawk's hand froze, his face a mask of frustrated rage. You're just guessing. Am I? Ghost picked up a bottle, poured 2 glasses. Your breathing changed, shortened. Your spurs clinked when you shifted your weight. The floorboard under. Your left boot creaked. He turned, holding both glasses. Little things, things most men never notice. He set 1 glass at each end of the bar. But John noticed them, taught me to notice them too, turned me from a fast gun into something else entirely. A bartender, Blackhawk spat. A student, Ghost. Corrected. Every man who walked into this saloon taught me something. How bullies telegraph their punches, how liars blink too often, and how killers, he looked directly at Blackhawk, can't keep their eyes off their target. As if to prove his point, Blackhawk's gaze darted to Ghost's gun hand, then back to his face. The Desert Phantom, John Harper whispered in awe. They say he could shoot a man's gun from his hand at 50 paces in pitch darkness. Could, Ghost. Agreed. Can. Then to demonstrate, he closed his eyes. Right now, Jenkins is trying to inch toward the shotgun on the floor. Matthew Harper is thinking about making a break for the door, and you, Blackhawk, his eyes opened, you're wondering if you can get to that derringer in your left boot before I can draw. The outlaw's face went pale. No one had seen the hidden gun. How? The way your boot sits, the slight bulge, the way you keep your left leg angled. Details. Always details. Doc Wilson spoke up from where he worked on Carson. The deputy's stable, but his pulse is weak. He needs a doctor's office, proper tools. Ghost nodded without taking his eyes off Blackhawk. Then it's time to end this, one way or another. You against all of us at once, Blackhawk said, but his voice lacked conviction. Don't need to be. Already know what you're all going to do. Ghost's voice hardened slightly. Matthew will run. He's a coward at heart. Jenkins will try something clever and get himself killed. And you, he paused, you'll go for your gun because your pride won't let you do anything else. You're awfully sure of yourself, Blackhawk growled. No, Ghost corrected. I'm sure of you. Men like you, they're all the same. Think their reputation makes them special. Think being feared makes them important. He shook his head slowly. But fear is just another tell, another shadow to read. Lightning flashed again, and this time when the thunder rolled, it seemed to shake the very foundations of the saloon. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. Last chance, Ghost said quietly, because once this starts, all the lessons in the world won't help you. Once this starts, I will stop being the bartender, stop being a student. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I become what I was before. What John tried so hard to help me leave behind. And what's that? Blackhawk asked, though his face suggested he already knew the answer. Ghost's reply was simple, final. Death walking. The moment shattered like a mirror hitting stone. Matthew. Harper made his break for the door, just as Ghost had predicted. Jenkins lunged for the fallen shotgun, his movements telegraphed seconds before he began. And Blackhawk went for his hidden derringer with snake-like speed. But Ghost was faster. He'd been faster 4 years ago, and time hadn't changed. That truth. His first shot caught the door's heavy wooden beam, dropping it into place just as Harper reached it. His second knocked the shotgun another foot away from Jenkins' grasping fingers. And his third. His third sent Black Hawk's derringer spinning through the air in a spray of blood and splinters from the outlaw's boot. All three shots had come so close together they sounded like a single rolling thunderclap. "Jesus Christ," Harper whispered. "That's 3 bullets." "You're not as fast as you used to be," Black Hawk taunted, clutching his bleeding hand. "The old phantom would have killed us all by now." "Maybe," Ghost agreed. "Or maybe John's lessons went deeper than you think." Thunder crashed outside as if emphasizing his words. The storm had reached its peak, rain hammering against the windows with renewed fury. In the dim light, shadows danced across the walls like restless spirits. "Your reputation," Black Hawk continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone, "says you never miss, never waste a bullet. But you just used 3 shots, and we're all still breathing." "Wasn't trying to kill you," Ghost replied. "Not yet." That brought Black Hawk up short. "What?" "Giving you a chance to see what you're up against, to make the smart choice." Ghost's eyes swept the room. "All of you, because what happens next, that's on your heads, not mine." The Harper brothers exchanged glances, then slowly raised their hands. "We surrender," Matthew said, his voice trembling. "The kid was right. This ain't worth dying over." "Cowards!" Black Hawk spat. But Ghost was already moving with smooth efficiency. He pulled 2 pairs of handcuffs from behind the bar, where they'd hung next to the shotgun all these years, and slid them across the floor to the brothers. "Put them on each other," he ordered. "Tight. I'll know if you don't." "Nate!" Sarah started to protest, but he cut her off. "The rest of Black Hawk's gang," he said quietly. "The ones who weren't with him in Silver Creek. The ones I should have known were coming." His eyes met hers. "Get them out, please." The hoofbeats stopped outside. Bootsteps approached the saloon doors, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the metallic click of weapons being readied. "Well, Phantom," Black Hawk's smile widened, "still think you can read every man's intentions?" "No," Ghost replied, moving to stand between the approaching footsteps and his wounded friend. "But I can read yours, and I know what's coming through. That door isn't near as dangerous as what's already inside." Lightning flashed once more, and in its brilliant glare, the desert phantom's silhouette seemed to grow, spreading across the floor like a promise or a warning. The saloon doors creaked open slowly, deliberately. Through the gap came the gleam of gun barrels, maybe a dozen of them. The storm's fury painted everything in shades of shadow and lightning, turning the armed men into looming silhouettes. "Quite a reunion," the lead figure drawled, stepping into the light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from granite and eyes like chips of ice. The famous desert phantom tending bar in a dusty nowhere town. Almost didn't believe it when the boys rode out to tell us. "Virgil Kane," Ghost said quietly. "Still riding with trash, I see." "Still breathing," Kane corrected, his eyes taking in the scene, his captured companions, the wounded men, the growing pool of blood around Deputy Carson. "Which is more than I can say for some folks." More men filed in behind him, spreading out with practiced precision. Sarah, still trying to help Doc Wilson move Carson, counted 12 guns, all pointed at Ghost. "Sarah," Ghost's voice was soft, but carried an edge of steel. "Get John out now." "Nobody's going anywhere," Kane commanded. His men shifted to block both exits. "Not until we settle some old business." Black Hawk, still handcuffed, laughed from his position on the floor. "Told you there'd be complications, Phantom. Kane's been running what's left of the Red Hand Roberts gang since you killed the old man." "Silver Falls," Kane nodded. "Been a long time since anyone spoke that name, but some debts don't fade with time." Ghost's gun hadn't moved, still trained on Black Hawk, but his eyes scanned the room, reading angles, distances, shadows. "Your brother made his choice in Silver Falls," he said to Kane, "same as Red Hand did." "My brother was 19. Kane's voice cracked like a whip. "Your brother was a killer," Ghost corrected. Same as you, same as Red Hand. He chose his path. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the hatred in Kane's eyes. And you chose to gun him down, shot him in the back while he was running. No. Ghost's denial was flat, absolute. I shot him in the front while he was drawing on a woman and her children. I saw his eyes when he died. He knew what he was doing, just like you know what you're doing now. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Doc Wilson had managed to get Carson into a sitting position against the wall, but the deputy's breathing was labored. 12 guns, Kane said softly. 12 experienced killers against one washed-up legend playing bartender. How do you like those odds, Phantom? Better than you'd think. Ghost's voice remained steady. Because I've been watching your men since they walked in. The one by the window's favoring his right leg. Old injury, probably slows his draw. The two by the bar are standing too close together. They'll get in each other's way. The one behind you is scared, his gun hands shaking so bad he's likely to shoot one of his own. Kane's eyes narrowed. You always talk too much. Part of being a bartender, Ghost replied. You learn to read people, learn their habits, their fears. Like how your left eye twitches when you're about to draw, just like it did in Silver Falls, just before your brother died. The words hit Kane like physical blows, his face contorted with rage. Kill him, he roared. Kill him now. What happened? Next seemed to unfold in slow motion, yet was over in seconds. Ghost moved like liquid shadow, his gun barking 3 times before anyone could react. The first shot took out the lamp above Kane's head, plunging half the room into darkness. The second caught the floorboard at the feet of the 2 men by the bar, sending them stumbling into each other. The third hit the window behind the injured gunman, making him duck instinctively. In the confusion, Ghost rolled behind an overturned table as guns blazed, bullets splintering wood and shattering bottles, filling the air with the smell of gunpowder. And spilled whiskey. Get John out, Ghost shouted to Sarah over the chaos. Doc, go with her. Emma and Wilson half-carried, half-dragged Carson toward the back door as Kane's men tried to adjust to the darkness. Spread out, Kane commanded. He's just one man. One man who knows this room better than he knows himself. Ghost's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. One man who spent 4 years memorizing every creak in these floorboards, every shadow cast by these lamps, every angle bullets can travel. A shot rang out, and one of Kane's men screamed, his gun hand suddenly useless. One man, Ghost continued, who's had 4 years to prepare for exactly this kind of night. Another shot, another cry of pain. Kane's men were shooting at shadows. Now, at movements glimpsed in lightning flashes, at the ghost of a legend who seemed to be everywhere at once. You're just proving what I always said, Kane shouted into the darkness. You're a killer, Phantom, a cold-blooded murderer hiding behind fancy words and a bartender's apron. No, Ghost's voice was closer now. I'm what John taught me to be. A man who chooses his battles, and right now I'm choosing to give your men a chance to walk away. One of Kane's gunmen suddenly bolted for the door, then another. In the storm's flickering light, their fear was plain to see. Cowards, Kane roared. Stand and fight. They're not cowards, Ghost said quietly. They're smart. They figured out what you haven't, that there's a difference between being willing to kill and being willing to die. Only 5 of Kane's men remained now, plus Kane himself. Black Hawk watched it all with a mixture of fury and fascination, his earlier bravado replaced by something like awe. Come on, Phantom, Kane challenged, spinning in place, trying to locate his target. Face me like a man, or are you just going to hide in the dark like the coward who shot my brother? I didn't hide then. Ghost's voice came from directly behind. And I'm not hiding now. Kane whirled, his gun coming up, but he was far too late. The Desert Phantom stood less than 3 feet away, his weapon already leveled. Your brother died trying to murder innocents, Ghost said softly. Is that really the legacy you want to die for? Lightning flashed one final time, illuminating them both in stark relief. Kane with hatred twisting his features, Ghost with The calm certainty of a man who had made peace with violence long ago. And in that frozen moment, Kane's left eye twitched. The shot came not from Kane, but from behind. One of his remaining men had circled around in the chaos. Ghost felt the bullet tear through his left shoulder, spinning him sideways. His own shot at Kane went wide, shattering a mirror behind the bar. "Not so legendary now, are you?" Kane laughed, regaining his confidence as Ghost stumbled against a table. The great desert phantom, bleeding like any other man. Ghost's gun hand stayed steady, but blood darkened his shirt at an alarming rate. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was bad enough to matter, to slow him down, to make him human. "Sarah!" he shouted, hearing movement near the back door. "I told you to get out!" "Not without you," she called back, and he heard the distinctive sound of her rifle being cocked. "Don't!" he warned, but it was too late. Sarah's shot caught one of Kane's remaining men in the leg, dropping him, but the muzzle flash gave away her position, and another of Kane's men was already turning, his gun rising. Ghost didn't hesitate. He threw himself across the room, his injured shoulder screaming in protest, and tackled Sarah as the outlaw's bullet whistled through the space where she had been. They crashed behind the bar together as bottles exploded overhead. "Touching." Kane's voice dripped with mockery. "The Phantom does have a heart, after all. Makes me wonder—" A pause, then, "Bring the deputy back in here." Ghost's blood ran cold as he heard the sounds of struggle. One of Kane's men must have circled around outside. He had Doc Wilson at gunpoint, forcing him and Carson back through the door. "Let them go," Ghost called out, his voice steady despite the pain. "This is between us." "No," Kane replied. "This is about family, about watching the ones you love die, just like I had to watch my brother die. The great desert phantom, brought low by the same weakness that retired him in the first place. You care too much." Sarah tried to rise, but Ghost held her down, as more bullets splintered the bar above them. "Stay still," he whispered. "Please." "You can't save them all, Phantom," Kane shouted. "Just like you couldn't save that woman in Silver Falls. What was her name?" "Catherine?" The name hit Ghost like a physical blow. 4 years of peace, of trying to forget, crashed down around him. He saw Catherine's face, heard her last words, felt her blood on his hands all over again. "That's right." Kane pressed his advantage. "The boys told me all about her, how you tried to leave this life behind for her, how Red Hand's gang found you anyway, how you weren't fast enough to save her." "Don't." Ghost's voice was barely a whisper. "And now history repeats itself." Kane's boots creaked on the floorboards as he moved closer. "The deputy who tried to save your soul, the woman who gave you a chance at a new life, the doctor who kept your secrets. Which one should die first?" Sarah's hand found Ghosts in the darkness behind the bar. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "you gave us 4 years of peace. That's worth something." But Ghost barely heard her. His mind was racing backward through time to that night in Silver Falls when it had all gone wrong, when he'd been too confident, too sure of himself, too convinced that his reputation would keep Catherine safe. "I can't," he started, his voice cracking. "Can't what?" Kane taunted. "Can't save them. Can't bear to watch them die? Or can't admit that everything John taught you about peace was a lie?" The storm outside had begun to fade, the thunder growing more distant. In the relative quiet, Ghost could hear Carson's labored breathing, Doc Wilson's attempts to keep him steady, Sarah's heart pounding next to him. "You know what your problem is, Phantom?" Kane continued. "You never understood what this life really means. It's not about being the fastest or the deadliest. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes, to sacrifice anyone and anything to win." Ghost closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his gun, the burn of his wound, the tremor in his hands that came not from fear, but from something deeper, the knowledge that whatever he did next would define him forever. "You're right," he said. Finally, his voice carrying clearly through the smoky air. "I do care too much. Always have." He squeezed Sarah's hand once, then let go. That's what John saw in me all those years ago. Not just a fast gun, but a man who could feel the weight of every trigger pull, every life taken. Philosophy won't save them, Kane sneered. No, Ghost agreed, but it might save you. He raised his voice. All of you, listen carefully. In about 10 seconds, I'm going to stand up. I'm going to drop my gun, and then you're going to have a choice. The only choice, Kane laughed, is which one dies first. Wrong. Ghost's voice had changed, becoming something ancient and terrible. The choice is whether you want to be the men who killed an injured deputy, a doctor trying to save lives, and an innocent woman, or the men who walked away and lived to tell about it. You're in no position to make threats, Kane said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Not a threat, Ghost replied, a prophecy. Because if you harm any of them, if you spill one more drop of innocent blood in this saloon, he took a deep breath, then the desert phantom stops trying to save your lives and goes back to what he does best. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wounded had stopped their moaning, sensing something momentous about to unfold. You're bluffing, Kane said finally, but his voice shook slightly. Am I? Ghost asked softly. You've heard the stories. You know what I was, what I can be again. So ask yourself, do you really want to force that choice? Do you want to be the one who brings death back to life? Sarah felt him shifting beside her, preparing to rise. Ghost, she whispered. Don't. But he was already standing, his gun held loosely at his side. Blood dripped steadily from his wounded shoulder, but his eyes were what held everyone transfixed. They were no longer the eyes of a bartender or even of a legendary gunfighter. They were the eyes of a man looking into an abyss and choosing to step forward anyway. Time seemed to crystallize in the smoke-filled saloon. Ghost stood exposed, his gun pointed at the floor. Blood darkened his left sleeve, but his stance was steady. Kane and his remaining men held their positions, weapons trained on their various hostages. Even the storm outside had hushed, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Drop the gun, Kane ordered, but his voice trembled slightly. Ghost's weapon hit the floor with a sound like distant thunder. The clatter echoed through the room, emphasized by the absolute silence that followed. There, Ghost said quietly, now you have what you wanted. The desert phantom, unarmed and bleeding. His eyes found Kane's across the room. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Kill him, Blackhawk called from his position on the floor, still handcuffed. Kill him now before he tries something. But Kane hesitated, and in that hesitation, Ghost saw something he recognized. The same doubt he'd felt in Silver Falls, the moment before everything changed. Your brother had that same look, Ghost said softly, right before he made his choice. Right before he decided that killing was easier than living with doubt. Shut up, Kane's gun wavered slightly. You don't get to talk about him. I remember every man I've killed. Ghost continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, every face, every moment. Your brother's eyes were green like your mother's. He told me that right before he drew, said it was the only good thing he got from her. Kane's face went pale. How did you? Because I listened, Ghost replied simply. That's what John taught me, that every man, even the ones you have to kill, deserves to be heard, to be remembered. Boss, one of Kane's remaining men called nervously, something ain't right here. 4 years, Ghost went on, taking a small step forward. 4 years I've poured drinks and listened to stories, learned that every man who walks through those doors is carrying something, pain, fear, regret. Another step. Even you, Virgil, especially you, stay back. Kane's gun tracked Ghost's movement, but his hand was shaking now. You know what I learned most of all? Ghost's voice dropped lower, becoming almost gentle. I learned that the man who needs everyone to fear him is usually the most frightened of all. At that moment, several things happened at once. Doc Wilson, seeing Kane's attention fixed on Ghost, shifted his weight to shield the wounded deputy. Sarah's hand found the butt of her fallen rifle beneath the bar, and the last of Kane's loyal men began backing toward the door. "Now!" Kane shouted, but his men didn't move. They had seen something in Ghost's eyes that scared them more than their leader's wrath. "They're not going to shoot," Ghost said with quiet certainty, "because they finally understand what John taught me years ago, that there's a difference between being a killer and being a murderer. They'll shoot if I tell them to shoot." Kane's voice rose to a desperate pitch. "No," Ghost shook his head slowly. "They won't, because they can feel it. What's coming? What happens if they cross that line?" He took another step forward. "You feel it too, don't you, Virgil? That voice in your head telling you this isn't what your brother would have wanted. You don't know what he wanted." Kane's finger tightened on the trigger, uncertainty warring with rage on his face. "You killed him." "I forced his hand," Ghost corrected gently, "just like you're trying to force mine now. But ask yourself, is this really about your brother, or is it about you trying to live up to a legacy of violence that never brought anyone peace?" Kane's gun barrel dipped slightly, uncertainty warring with rage on his face. Behind him, his last two men exchanged glances and began moving slowly toward the exit. "You can still walk away," Ghost continued, close enough now that Kane's gun nearly touched his chest. "Can still choose a different path. That's what John taught me, that it's never too late to change." "Boss," one of the remaining outlaws called from the doorway, "we're leaving. This ain't worth dying for." "Cowards!" Kane's shout was ragged. "All of you! The great desert phantom is right in front of us, unarmed, and you're running." "No." Ghost's voice was barely a whisper now. "They're not running, they're living, something your brother never got the chance to learn." Kane's gun pressed against Ghost's chest, right over his heart. "I could kill you right now, end the legend once and for all." "Could," Ghost agreed, "but you won't, because you finally figured out what I learned 4 years ago, that pulling a trigger is easy, living with it afterward, that's the hard part." For a long moment, the only sound was the fading storm and Kane's ragged breathing. Then slowly, incredibly, his gun barrel began to lower. "What are you doing?" Blackhawk demanded from the floor. "Kill him! Kill all of them!" But Kane wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on Ghost's, seeing perhaps for the first time what his brother had seen in those final moments. Not a legend, not a killer, but a man who carried the weight of every life he'd taken. "My brother," Kane said heavily. "He really did draw first." "Yes," Ghost replied softly, "and his last words were about you, about hoping you'd choose a better path." The gun slipped from Kane's fingers, hitting the floor with a finality that seemed to echo through the years. Behind him, his last men melted away into the night, leaving only the sound of distant hoofbeats. "It's over," Ghost said quietly, not just to Kane, but to everyone in the room. "The killing stops here." Sarah emerged from behind the bar, her rifle trained on Kane, but her eyes on Ghost. Doc Wilson resumed tending to Carson, whose breathing had steadied, and outside the storm finally broke, moonlight streaming through the windows to paint silver paths across the bullet-scarred floor. Kane sank to his knees, years of hatred and vengeance draining from him like blood from a wound. What happens now?" Ghost's reply was interrupted by a weak voice from the corner. "Now," Deputy Carson said, struggling to sit up, "we all learn to live with our choices, just like I taught him to do all those years ago." The desert phantom looked at his old friend, then at the woman who had given him a chance at a new life, then finally at the man who had come to kill him but found redemption instead. "No," he corrected gently, "now we learn to live with our choices together." But the night wasn't finished with them yet. As Doc Wilson worked to stabilize Carson, a new sound cut through the quiet. More hoofbeats approaching fast. "Ghost," Sarah warned, moving to the window. "Riders coming in, at least 20 of them." Kane's head snapped up. Red Hand's old bunch from up north. I sent word before we rode in, told them where to find the Desert Phantom. They won't care that I've surrendered. They'll burn this whole town just to get to you. Ghost's face didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Sarah, get everyone into the cellar. Doc, you too. Take John and the prisoners. What are you going to do? Sarah asked, though her face suggested she already knew. Ghost picked up his fallen gun, checking the cylinder with practiced ease. What I should have done 4 years ago. Finish it. All of it. You can't face 20 men alone, Kane protested. Even you're not that good. He's not alone. Carson's voice came stronger now. Sarah, give me my gun. John, you can barely stand, Ghost started, but the deputy cut him off. You taught me about peace, Carson said, struggling to his feet with Doc Wilson's help. Let me teach you one last thing. Sometimes keeping the peace means standing together. I'll help too, Kane said quietly. When they all turned to look at him, he shrugged. My brother wanted me to find a better path. Maybe this is it. The hoofbeats grew louder, and with them came the sound of men shouting, of bottles breaking as the newcomers announced their presence by shooting out windows. Up and down the street. Ghost, Sarah said softly. What do we do? The Desert Phantom stood in the center of his saloon, surrounded by former enemies turned allies, and for the first time that night, he smiled. A real smile, not the careful one he'd worn for 4 years. Now, he said, checking his gun one. Final time. We show them why the quietest man in town is usually the most dangerous. The night air crackled with tension as Ghost surveyed the saloon, his mind already calculating angles, positions, advantages. 4 years of serving drinks had taught him every creaking floorboard, every shadowed corner, every potential piece of cover. Now that knowledge would serve a different purpose. Sarah, moved those tables there and there, he pointed, his voice steady and sure. Create a barrier between the front windows and the bar. Doc, get John and the wounded into the cellar, anyone who can't fight. I can still shoot, Blackhawk called from his position on the floor. When they all turned to look at him, he shrugged, his cuffed hands. What? I'm not letting some northern boys steal my glory. The Desert Phantom's mine to kill, after we deal with them. Ghost's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. Keep your cuffs on, but give him a gun, he told. Sarah, better the devil we know. Kane moved to the window, staying in the shadows. 23 riders, he reported grimly. Red Hand's old guard, mean bunch. They've split up, moving to surround the building. Good, Ghost said, surprising them all. Means they're following the old playbook, the one I wrote. What do you mean? Sarah asked, handing out ammunition from behind the bar. Red Hand's gang, they were mine before they were his. Back before Silver Falls, before... He paused. Before Catherine. I taught them every trick they know about siege warfare. Then they know how you think, Kane warned. They'll be ready for your tactics. No, Ghost's voice held a certainty that made them all pause. They know how the Desert Phantom thinks, but I'm not just the Phantom anymore. He moved behind the bar, reaching beneath it to pull out not just weapons, but tools, rope, and various bottles. I'm a bartender. And you'd be amazed what a man learns about improvisation when he's breaking up fights and dealing with drunk cowboys for 4 years. Outside, a voice boomed through the night. Desert Phantom, we know you're in there. Send out Kane and Blackhawk, and maybe we'll kill you quick. Charming bunch, Sarah muttered, checking her rifle. They always lacked manners, Ghost agreed. Then raising his voice, Boys, I'm going to give you the same choice I gave these gentlemen. Walk away now. Live to see the sunrise. Mocking laughter answered him. The great Phantom's gone soft. Red Hand would be ashamed to see you now. Red Hand died badly, Ghost called back, his voice carrying an edge that made even Kane flinch. Shot 7 times and still too stubborn to admit he was. Wrong? You want to follow his example? A bullet shattered one of the remaining windows in response, sending glass tinkling across the floor. "I guess that's a no," Carson said dryly from his position behind an overturned table. The deputy was pale but steady, his gun hand unwavering. Ghost nodded, then turned to his unlikely allies. "They'll come in waves, try to overwhelm us with numbers. They don't know how many of us are in here, so they'll be cautious at first. We use that." "What's the play?" Kane asked, and Ghost was struck by how quickly the man had shifted from enemy to tactical advisor. "First, we change the battlefield." Ghost began mixing liquids from various bottles into one large container. "Sarah, remember last month when Big Mike Thompson knocked over the coal oil lamp and nearly burned the place down? You want to burn your own saloon?" she asked incredulously. "No," Ghost's smile was wolf-like. "I want them to think we're desperate. Enough to try." He handed the container to Kane. "When I give the signal, throw this at the front door. It'll make a lot of smoke, but it won't actually catch. Should make them hesitate, bunch up." "And that's when we hit them," Carson finished. "Understanding dawning." "Partly," Ghost agreed, "but they'll be expecting that. What they won't expect is this." He pulled a length of rope from behind the bar. "Sarah, how's your aim with throwing things that aren't bullets?" Her eyes lit up with understanding. "Like that time I had to take down Drunk Dave with a bottle of whiskey?" "Exactly, only this time we're going to create a little surprise for anyone trying to come in through the back door." Ghost began rigging an intricate system of ropes and pulleys, using the saloon support beams. As they worked, the outlaws outside grew more restless. Random shots peppered the building, and voices called out increasingly creative threats. "They're getting impatient," Kane observed. "Won't be long before they rush us." "Good," Ghost said, finishing his preparations. "The more impatient they are, the more mistakes they'll make. And we only need one mistake." He gathered them close, outlining positions and roles. Each person's strengths were considered, each weakness accounted for. Even Blackhawk, still in cuffs, was given a specific part to play. "Remember," Ghost said finally, "they're expecting the Desert Phantom, a legend, a killer. They're not expecting a bartender who knows every inch of this place, a deputy who never gives up, a saloon owner who can outshoot most men, and two reformed outlaws with something to prove." "And what are they getting?" Sarah asked softly. Ghost checked his gun one final time. "They're getting a lesson in why you should never underestimate a quiet man in a quiet town." The first assault came exactly as Ghost had predicted. 3 men rushed the front door, while others provided covering fire from various positions. The moment they hit the entrance, Kane threw the mixture Ghost had prepared. The liquid exploded into thick, acrid smoke, causing the attackers to stumble and bunch together. Ghost's gun barked twice, impossibly fast. 2 of the men fell, clutching wounded legs. The third dove back outside, leaving his hat behind. "That's 2 who will live to reconsider their choices," Ghost said calmly. 21 to go. "Persistent bunch," Carson commented, as more bullets splintered the doorframe. "You have no idea," Kane replied grimly. "I've seen them lay siege to a ranch house for 3 days just to kill 1 man. "Well, they're not getting 3 days," Ghosty said. "Sarah?" She nodded, moving into position with her rope. On the other side of the saloon, they could hear men trying to force the back door. "Wait for it," Ghost cautioned. "Let them commit." The back door burst open with a crash. 4 men charged in, guns raised, and ran straight into Sarah's trap. The rope she released dropped a heavy net of bottles and glasses onto them from above. The resulting chaos was spectacular. Ghost and Kane moved as one, their shots precise. When the dust settled, 4 more men lay groaning, their weapons scattered across the floor. 15, Ghost counted calmly. "And they've lost the element of surprise. You'll die for this, Phantom," a voice roared from outside. "We'll burn this place to the ground with you in it." "Now there's an idea," Ghost mused. "Sarah, remember what I said about improvisation?" She grinned, already moving to collect. certain bottles from behind the bar. Just like making prairie fire shots for the cowboys. Similar principle, bigger scale. Ghost began arranging the bottles in specific positions. Kane, when I give the word, I need you to shoot that mirror, the one high on the wall. What are you planning? Blackhawk asked, curiosity overcoming his natural hostility. A demonstration, Ghost replied, in why a bartender knows more about fire and glass than any outlaw. The outlaws outside were getting bolder, their shots becoming more focused. They'd figured out the angles, were trying to pin down the defenders with concentrated fire, while others worked their way closer to the building. They're adapting, Kane. He warned, ducking as a bullet splintered the windowsill near his head. So are we, Ghost replied, carefully arranging the last bottle in his elaborate setup. Each container held a different mixture of spirits and other liquids from behind the bar, positioned to catch and reflect light in specific ways. John, you remember that trick shot competition at the county fair 3 years ago? The one where you refused to compete, Carson asked, managing a weak smile despite his wound. Wasn't my kind of show, Ghost said softly. But I learned something watching those fancy shooters about light and angles and how to make one bullet do the work of many. A voice called from outside, closer now. Last chance, Phantom. Throw out your guns and maybe some of these fine... Folks live, always with the threats, Ghost sighed. Sarah, you ready? She nodded, holding a special bottle he'd prepared. Just like we practiced. Kane, on my mark. Shoot that mirror, high left corner, where the silver's showing through. Blackhawk, when I say, put a bullet right through that blue bottle on the end. Both men nodded, though Blackhawk couldn't quite hide his skepticism. What's this supposed to accomplish? Physics, Ghost replied simply, and a little bartender's chemistry. He raised his voice to carry outside. You boys ever wonder why they call this the Silver Spur Saloon? Because you'll be wearing silver. Spurs in your coffin, someone shouted back, followed by mean laughter. No, Ghost's voice held a hint of amusement. It's because of what happens when moonlight hits silver just right, especially when there's something to carry that light where you want it to go. He nodded to Sarah, who threw her bottle high into the air through one of the broken windows. At the same moment, Ghost called out, Now! Kane's shot shattered the mirror precisely where Ghost had indicated. Blackhawk, despite his bound hands, hit the blue bottle dead center. The resulting chain reaction was spectacular. Sarah's bottle exploded in the air, its contents catching the reflected moonlight from the broken mirror. The light bounced through Ghost's carefully arranged bottles, each one magnifying and redirecting it. The special mixtures inside caught and held the light, creating brilliant blinding flares that illuminated the street outside like day. In that sudden, harsh brightness, every outlaw's position was revealed. More importantly, they were all momentarily blinded, having grown accustomed to the darkness. Ghost moved like his namesake, his gun seeming to speak in one continuous roll of thunder. 7 shots, 7 cries of pain. When the light show ended, 7 more men lay writhing in the street, their guns fallen from numbed hands. That's right, left, Ghost announced calmly, reloading with practiced ease. And now they know we can see them. Holy hell, Blackhawk breathed, genuine admiration in his voice. You used bar tricks to outflank a gang of killers. Not tricks, Ghost corrected. Understanding. Every bottle tells a story, how it breaks, how it burns, how it carries light. Pay attention long enough, you learn to read those stories. They're pulling back, Kane reported from his window. Regrouping, but Jackson's out there. I can hear him giving orders. He won't let them retreat. Jackson, Sarah asked. Red Hand's old lieutenant, Ghost explained. Mean piece of work. Likes to play with his food before he kills it. As if to emphasize his point, Jackson's voice carried through the night. Nice. Show, Phantom, proper saloon entertainment. But let me show you how we do things up north. The sound of breaking glass came from above, followed by the distinct smell of coal oil. They're trying to smoke us out, Carson realized. No, Ghost's Voice was grim. They're trying to burn us out. It's what Jackson does. Likes to watch people choose between burning and running into his guns. We can't stay here, Sarah said, coughing, as the first wisps of smoke began to seep through the ceiling. We're not going to. Ghost was already moving, gathering specific bottles from his remaining stock. Kane, how good are you at hitting moving targets? Best shot in 3 territories, Kane replied without false modesty. Until I met you. Good, because we're about to give Jackson a lesson in why you don't try to burn down a bartender's place of business. Ghost began mixing contents from various bottles into 2 large containers. Sarah, remember last New Year's, when you wanted something special for the celebration? Her eyes widened. The waterfall effect, but that was just for show. Same principle, different application. Ghost handed 1 container to Kane and another to Blackhawk. When I give the word, throw these straight up through those broken ceiling boards. Don't get any on yourselves. What is it? Blackhawk asked, sniffing suspiciously at his container. Something that burns a lot brighter than coal oil, Ghost replied, but only for a few seconds, just long enough. More coal oil was being poured onto the roof now. They could hear boots moving above them, could smell the sharp tang of accelerants getting stronger. They're surrounding the building with it, Kane warned. Once they light it, they won't get the chance. Ghost positioned himself in the center of the room, his gun held ready. Everyone get ready. When those containers explode, we'll have exactly 3 seconds before Jackson realizes his mistake. Make them count. What about the fire? Carson asked. Trust me, Ghost said softly. I've been preparing for something like this ever since Catherine died in a burning building. Never. Again, Sarah's hand found his arm. Ghost. I'm all right, he assured her, though his eyes held old pain. Some ghosts you live with, others you put to rest. He raised his voice. Ready? They nodded, taking their positions. Above, they could hear Jackson giving final orders to his men. Light it up, Jackson's voice carried clearly. Let's see the great desert phantom dance. Now, Ghost commanded. Kane and Blackhawk threw their containers up through the broken ceiling boards. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the night turned to day. The special mixture Ghost had prepared didn't just ignite, it exploded in a brilliant cascade of chemical fire, falling back onto the coal oil-soaked roof. But instead of spreading, it consumed the accelerant in seconds, burning so hot and bright that Jackson's men stumbled back with cries of pain and surprise. In those precious seconds of confusion, Ghost's plan came together. Kane's rifle barked twice, taking down the men on the left side of the roof. Sarah's shot caught one trying to run right. Even Carson, wounded as he was, managed to clip one who was about to throw a torch. But it was Ghost who moved like a force of nature. The moment the chemical fire began to fade, he was through the door, gun blazing. 3 more outlaws fell before they could even turn around. Jackson! Ghost's voice carried above the chaos. Just you and me now. Face me like a man, or run like the coward you are. A shot rang out from behind a water trough, the bullet cutting so close to Ghost's head that he felt it stir his hair. Still fast, Jackson called out, his voice heavy with mockery. But are you fast enough to save them all this time? The words hit Ghost like physical blows, stirring memories he'd tried to bury. He could almost smell the smoke from that night. In Silver Falls, hearing Catherine's final scream as the flames took her. You weren't there, Ghost replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. You don't get to speak about that night. Oh, but Red Hand told us all about it. Jackson's laugh was cruel. How you tried to save her, how you couldn't decide whether to shoot or rescue, how you failed at both. Inside the saloon, Sarah started to move forward, but Kane caught her arm. Wait, he whispered. Ghost needs to face this demon alone. You want to know what really happened that night? Ghost's voice carried across the street, soft but clear. Red Hand left that part out, didn't he? about how he was the one who set the fire, but didn't have the courage to face me himself, about how he sent others to die while he watched from safety. She deserved what she got, Jackson shouted. Anybody who tries to tame a killer deserves. The shot seemed to come from the very air itself. Jackson's gun went spinning away, along with two of his fingers. He fell to his knees, clutching his ruined hand, and found Ghost standing before him, as if he'd materialized from the shadows. "That's the last time you speak her name," Ghost said softly. "The last time anyone speaks it in hate." Jackson looked up, his face twisted with pain and rage. "Do it, then! Finish it! Show everyone you're still the killer you always were." But Ghost's gun was already back in its holster. No, Catherine wouldn't want that. Neither would John. The killing stops here. "You're soft," Jackson spat. Red Hand was right. You're not the legend anymore. Just a weak-hearted bartender playing. That Ghost moved faster than thought. His boot caught Jackson under the chin, laying him out flat. "I'm not going to kill you," he said calmly. "But if you say one more word about Catherine, about John, about any of them—" He left the threat unfinished. From the saloon doorway, Sarah and the others watched as Ghost bent down and began methodically disarming the fallen outlaw. His movements were precise, professional, more like a man taking inventory than a legendary gunfighter. "You know what the hardest part of being a bartender is?" Ghost asked conversationally as he worked. "It's not the long hours, or the drunk cowboys, or even breaking up fights. It's learning to let go of the anger, learning to see men at their worst and still believe they can be better." He straightened up, Jackson's weapons collected neatly in his arms. "That's what Catherine taught me, what John reminded me of. Every person who walks through those doors is carrying something. Pain, fear, regret. Even men like you, Jackson. Especially men like you." What are you going to do with me?" Jackson asked, his bravado finally cracking. Ghost's smile was sad. "I'm going to do what Catherine would have wanted, what John taught me. I'm going to give you a chance to be better." Dawn broke over Rattlesnake Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. The Dusty Spur saloon bore the scars of the night's violence, bullet holes in the walls, broken glass glinting on the floor, bloodstains that would never quite wash away. But it still stood, much like the man who had defended it. Ghost worked methodically behind the bar, his left arm in a sling, cleaning glasses just as he had done every morning for the past 4 years. The routine was the same, but something had changed, not just in him, but in the very air of the place. "You don't have to do that now," Sarah said softly, watching him from the doorway. "Doc Wilson said you need rest." "Rest can wait," Ghost replied, not looking up. "Some things need to be put right first." Through the window they could see Deputy Carson being tended to in Doc Wilson's office across the street. The lawman would live, though he'd carry another scar to add to his collection. In the jail next door, Jackson and his surviving men sat quietly in their cells, their fighting spirits broken not by violence but by understanding. Words already spreading, Sarah continued, moving to help him despite his protests. "About what happened here, about who you really are." "Who I was," Ghost corrected gently. "The Desert Phantom died last night, along with a lot of old ghosts." "Did he?" Sarah's voice carried a hint of doubt. "Those men who ran, they'll talk. More will come, looking to make a name for themselves." Ghost finally stopped his work, looking at her directly. "Let them come. They'll find what those before them found. Just a bartender who listens more than he shoots." The morning light caught the silver in his hair, the new lines around his eyes. He looked both older and younger somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted, even as a new one settled in its place. "You're really going to stay?" Sarah asked, hope warring with concern in her voice. "Even after all this?" 4 years ago, Ghost said slowly, John Carson found me in Silver Falls, drowning in guilt and whiskey after Catherine's death. He could have drawn on me, tried to bring in what was left of the Desert Phantom. Instead, he sat down and ordered a drink. Talked to me about peace, about choices, about the difference between living and just surviving. He touched the scar on his shoulder, still fresh and painful. Last night, I finally understood what he was trying to teach me. It's not about hanging up your guns or pretending the past never happened. It's about choosing who you want to be every single day. The door creaked open, and old Tom shuffled in, right on time for his morning drink. He paused, taking in the destruction, then smiled, toothless. "Heard there was some excitement last night," he said, settling onto his usual stool. "Sorry I missed it." Ghost's lips twitched in what might have been a smile as he poured the old man his usual. Some things, at least, hadn't changed. "Town's already talking about rebuilding," Sarah said, watching Tom take his first sip. "Deputy Carson says he'll recommend a commendation for how you handled things. Without killing anyone, I mean." John always did believe in redemption. Ghost nodded. Even for men like Jackson, maybe especially for men like Jackson, came a familiar voice from the doorway. They turned to see Kane standing there, looking uncertain. Ghost studied him for a moment, then reached for another glass. "Buy you a drink?" Kane stepped inside, his movements hesitant. "After everything that happened, everything I did, Catherine used to say," Ghost replied softly, "that the measure of a man isn't in how he falls, but in how he chooses to get back up." Through the window, they could see people beginning to emerge from their homes, life returning to Rattlesnake Ridge. Children played in the street, women hung laundry, men nodded respectfully as they passed the saloon. But there was something different in how they looked at the dusty spur now, not fear exactly, but awareness, understanding. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "I always wondered why you chose this place. Why here, of all the towns you could have disappeared to?" Ghost was quiet for a long moment, his hands moving automatically through their familiar routine. "Because it was quiet," he said finally. "Because it needed someone to tend the bar and listen to stories." He paused, looking around at the bullet-scarred walls, the broken bottles, the first rays of sun painting everything in new light. Because some places, like some people, deserve a second chance. The door opened again, and Doc Wilson entered, looking exhausted but satisfied. "John's going to make it," he announced. "Says he wants to talk to you, Ghost, about the future." "Future's right here," Ghost replied, gesturing to the saloon around them. "Always was." As if to emphasize his point, he reached up and removed the shotgun from its hiding place behind the bar. Everyone watched as he unloaded it, then placed it carefully in a box with his gun belt. "Won't you need those?" Sarah asked softly. "If others come looking for the Phantom?" "No," Ghost shook his head, "because they won't find him. They'll find what Jackson and his men found, something a lot more dangerous than a fast gun." "And what's that?" Doc Wilson asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "A man at peace with his past," Ghost replied, returning to his endless task of polishing glasses. "A man who learned that the hardest battles are won with words instead of bullets. A man who finally understood what John was trying to teach him all along." "Which is?" Sarah pressed. Ghost looked up, and in his eyes they saw not the deadly gunfighter of legend, not the quiet bartender of the past 4 years, but something new, something that combined the strength of one with the wisdom of the other. "That true courage isn't about being faster than the other man's bullet," he said softly. "It's about being strong enough to offer him a drink instead." Kane lifted his glass. "To new beginnings? To choices," Ghost corrected, touching his glass to Kane's, "and to the people who help us make the right ones." Through the window, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night. Rattlesnake Ridge stirred to life around them, forever changed, but somehow stronger for it. "Speaking of choices," Kane said, setting down his glass, "what about Black Hawk and his men?" "Already made arrangements," Carson's voice came from the doorway. The deputy stood there, leaning heavily on a cane, but very much alive. army patrols, coming to take them to the territorial prison, though I'm thinking some of them might deserve a second chance too. Ghost helped the deputy to a chair. Your call, John. You're the law here. Maybe, Carson winced as he sat. But you're the one who showed me that sometimes the law needs to be tempered with understanding. He looked at Kane meaningfully. Some men just need a reason to change. And some men need a quiet bartender to show them how, Sarah added softly. Ghost continued his work, but a slight smile played at his lips. Speaking of the bar, he reached beneath it and pulled out a worn leather ledger. Sarah, you remember that conversation we had last month? About partnership? She stared at him. Place needs fixing up now anyway, Ghost shrugged. Good time for changes, proper changes. He opened the ledger to reveal a deed with both their names on it. If you're still interested. Partners, Sarah's voice caught slightly. Partners, Ghost confirmed. Equal share, equal say, though you might want to read the fine print first. Sarah took the deed with trembling hands, then laughed. The fine print says, no shooting customers unless absolutely necessary. Had to make sure you'd actually read it. Ghost's eyes twinkled. Catherine taught me that trick. Always hide. The important parts in the small details. The mention of Catherine's name didn't bring pain now, just a gentle ache of remembrance. Progress, Ghost thought, comes in small steps. Well, Doc Wilson said, rising from his chair, I should get back to my patients. Though I suspect this town's done with violence for a while. Perhaps, Ghost agreed. But if not, he gestured to the bar around them. We'll be ready, in our own way. The doctor paused at the door. You know, when you first came to town, I thought you were running from something. Now I realize you were running toward something instead. Wasn't running at all, Ghost corrected gently. Was just looking for the right place to stand still. As if to emphasize his point, he picked up another glass, resumed his eternal polishing. The motion was the same as it had been for 4 years, but now it carried a different weight, not a cover story, but a choice, not a hiding place, but a home. Old Tom, who had been quietly nursing his drink, suddenly spoke up. You know what I always said about you, Ghost, right from that first day? What's that, Tom? Said you reminded me of my pa's old hunting dog, gentlest creature you ever saw, until somebody threatened the family. Then the old man shook his head. Folks forgot that the quietest animals are usually the ones you need to watch closest. Wise man, your father, Ghost nodded. Weren't my father that was wise, Tom grinned, was the dog. They all laughed at that, and the sound seemed to wash away the last traces of tension from the air. This was how healing began, Ghost knew. Not with grand gestures, but with small moments of shared humanity. The door opened again, bringing with it a gust of morning air and Ruby Rose, still in last night's performance dress. I left my sheet music, she explained, then stopped, taking in the scene, the destruction, the bullet holes, the gathered group of unlikely friends. I heard what happened. What you did. Her eyes found ghosts. All these years, I sang songs about legendary gunfighters, never knowing I was performing for one. Not anymore, Ghost said quietly. Now you're performing for a bartender who happens to be pretty good with a gun. And a mop. He glanced meaningfully at the debris-strewn floor. Ruby laughed, then sobered. Will you tell us sometime? The real stories behind the songs? Ghost considered this. Maybe, but I think the stories we make from here on out will be more interesting. Less gunsmoke, more... He gestured to old Tom's empty glass. Humanity. Speaking of humanity, Sarah said, examining the deed again. What does the other fine print say about renovations? Because I have some ideas. Let me guess. Ghost's eyes crinkled. starting with moving the bar to where it's harder to shoot at. Actually, she grinned, I was thinking about adding a proper stage for Ruby, and maybe some of those fancy gas lamps they have in San Francisco. Going uptown on me, partner? Well, she matched his tone perfectly. A legendary gunfighter turned bartender needs a proper setting, don't you think? Former legendary gunfighter, Ghost corrected, but without heat. Current purveyor of spirits and occasional wisdom. And keeper of the peace, Carson added, in your own unique way. Kane, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke up. You know, my brother used to say something about peace. Said it was just the quiet before the bullets started flying. He stared into his glass. Took me until now to realize how wrong he was. Peace isn't the quiet, it's what you choose to do with it. Wise words, Ghost nodded. Your brother would be proud to hear you say them. Maybe, Kane managed a small smile, though I think he'd be more proud to see me trying to live them. A month had passed since the night the Desert Phantom returned and disappeared again. The Dusty Spur Saloon had been reborn, its battle scars worn now like badges of honor. New glass gleamed in the windows, the bullet holes had been patched, and Sarah's fancy new gas lamps cast a warm, welcoming glow across the polished bar. Ghost stood in his usual place, doing what he did best, listening. The saloon was fuller. These days, seemed like everyone in 3 territories wanted to have a drink in the place where legend and reality had met one stormy, dark night. Most came hoping for stories of the Desert Phantom, but they stayed for the quiet bartender's wisdom and Sarah's hospitality. Another round, Ghost, old Tom called from his corner. He had company these days, Kane, who'd taken to joining him for morning drinks and conversation about paths not taken and roads newly found. Coming right up, Ghost replied, his movements as precise as ever. The arm had healed clean, thanks to Doc Wilson's care, though it still aches when rain was coming. Just another reminder like the others he carried. The batwing doors swung open, bringing with them Deputy Carson, walking stronger now, though he still favored his left side. Evening, all, he nodded, making his way to the bar. Got some news from the territorial marshal. Oh? Ghost set a coffee cup in front of his old friend. Some habits didn't change. Black Hawk and his bunch. Carson took a careful sip. They're being given a choice. Prison time or working with the army as scouts. Seems your example got through. To them, their choice to make, Ghost said quietly, just like it was mine all those years ago. Speaking of choices, Sarah emerged from the back room, ledger in hand. That army patrol captain who came through yesterday says he's willing to pay good money to make this a regular stop for his men. Says any place that can turn the Desert Phantom into a peacekeeping bartender is worth supporting. Ghost's lips twitched. Did you tell him the Desert Phantom's just a story folks tell? Tried to, Sarah matched his almost smile. But you know how stories are. Sometimes the truth's more interesting than the legend. Ruby Rose's voice drifted down from her new proper stage, testing the acoustics. She'd written a new song, one about a quiet man who fought with wisdom instead of bullets. It was becoming popular up and down the frontier, though few knew it was more truth than tale. Got another letter from Jackson, Carson mentioned, sliding an envelope across the bar. 3rd one this month. Ghost nodded but didn't open it. He knew what it would say. The same thing the others had. Questions about peace, about change, about the weight of choices. He'd answer it later, carefully, as he had the others. Some battles were won with bullets, but the important ones were won with words and patience. Have you ever missed it? Kane asked suddenly from his corner. The reputation, the legend, the power of having men fear just your name. Ghost considered this as he poured another round. Miss it? No. Same way a man doesn't miss a fever once it breaks. What I was then, it was like a sickness of the soul. This, he gestured to the saloon around them, This is the cure. Though some folks still need reminding about the cure, Sarah added, with a meaningful look at a group of cowboys who were getting rowdy near the door. Ghost's quiet "gentleman" was all it took. They settled immediately, suddenly very interested in their drinks. His reputation might have changed, but his presence hadn't lost any of its power. It had just found a better purpose. "You know," Doc Wilson said, claiming his usual corner table, "when I first patched you up 4 years ago, I thought you were just hiding here, waiting for something. Took me a while to realize you were actually building something instead." "We all were," Ghost replied, nodding towards Sarah. "Still are." The door opened again, bringing with it a gust of evening air and a stranger, trail-worn, hard-eyed, gun riding low on his hip. The saloon quieted as he approached the bar, the way it often did these days when newcomers arrived. Everyone had heard the stories by now. "You the one they call Ghost?" the stranger asked, his voice carrying that edge that Ghost knew too well. "Welcome to the Dusty Spur," Ghost replied evenly. "What can I get you?" The stranger's hand twitched near his gun. "Heard stories about you, about who you used to be." "Just stories now," Ghost said quietly, continuing to polish a glass. "These days I'm just a bartender. But," he added, his voice taking on that tone that Sarah had come to recognize as a warning, "wrapped in wisdom, I do make a fair peace offering if you're interested." For a moment, tension crackled in the air. Then the stranger saw what others had learned to see, the calm in Ghost's eyes, the certainty in his stance, the weight of experience in his quiet words. Slowly, the hard look faded from the stranger's face. "Peace offering sounds good," he said finally. Ghost nodded and reached for a bottle, not the usual one, but a special reserve he kept for moments like this. As he poured 2 glasses, the stranger studied him. "They say you were the fastest gun in the territories, that you could shoot a man's thoughts before he knew he was thinking them." "Maybe," Ghost allowed, sliding 1 glass across the bar. "But I learned something more valuable than speed." He lifted his own glass. "I learned when not to shoot." The stranger considered this, then lifted his glass in return. Around them, the saloon breathed again, settling back into its comfortable rhythm. Sarah, watching from nearby, smiled to herself. Another bullet dodged without a shot fired, another soul given a chance to choose a better path. This was Ghost's true legacy, not the legend of the Desert Phantom, but the reality of a man who had found a better way to fight. "You know," the stranger said after a thoughtful sip, "I came here looking for the Desert Phantom, wanted to make a name for myself. And what did you find instead?" Ghost asked, though his slight smile suggested he already knew the answer. "A bartender," the stranger admitted. "One who seems to know a lot about second chances." "Second chances," Ghost agreed, refilling both glasses, "and third ones, and as many as it takes. Because that's what Catherine taught me, what John reminded me. Every soul deserves the chance to choose again, to be better than they were yesterday." Ruby's song drifted down from the stage, telling of a legend who found peace not in the speed of his gun, but in the strength of his heart. Ghost listened, remembering another song from another time, when Catherine had dreamed of turning a killer into a keeper of peace. "She would have liked this," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "The music, the laughter, the choices being made." "Who would have?" the stranger asked. Ghost smiled, a real smile, not the careful one he'd worn for so many years. "A woman who taught me that the measure of a man isn't in how many fights he wins, but in how many he prevents." He looked around the saloon, at the lives touched and changed, at the peace built one quiet word at a time. "She taught me that true strength isn't in being the fastest gun, but in being the first to offer a drink instead of drawing one." Outside, the sun was setting on another day in Rattlesnake Ridge. The desert wind still carried secrets, but they were different ones now. Stories not of the Desert Phantom's deadly speed, but of a quiet bartender who had found a better way to fight. And in the dusty Spur saloon, that bartender continued his eternal task of polishing glasses, listening to stories, and showing lost souls that even the deadliest rattler could learn to bring peace instead of poison. The legend of the Desert Phantom had indeed died that violent night, but something better had taken its place. A living example that the quietest man in town wasn't dangerous because of how fast he could draw, but because of how well he could see into troubled hearts and offer them a chance at redemption. And that, as Catherine had always said, was the greatest power of all. Later that night, after the saloon had quieted and most patrons had gone home, Ghost stood on the front porch, watching the stars emerge over the desert. Sarah joined him, too, glasses and a bottle in hand. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, pouring them each a measure. "Just thinking about stories," Ghost replied, accepting the glass. "How they change in the telling. How sometimes the truth is better than the legend." "Speaking of stories," she gestured toward the stranger, now deep in conversation with Kane. "At the corner table, that's the third one this week who came looking for the Phantom and found something else instead." "Fourth," Ghost corrected gently. "You missed the young fellow yesterday morning. Came in before opening, gun-hand itchy, left with a job offer from the stage company." Sarah smiled. "You're keeping count?" "Not of the men." Ghost shook his head. "Of the choices. Each one matters." Inside, they could hear Ruby Rose teaching her new song to some of the regulars. The chorus spoke of a desert wind that brought peace instead of storms, of a shadow that protected rather than threatened. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "when I inherited this place from my father, I thought I was just getting a saloon. Never imagined it would become—" "A sanctuary," Ghost offered. "A place of second chances," she corrected. "Though I suppose—" "That's the same thing." Deputy Carson emerged from his office across the street, making his evening rounds. He tipped his hat as he passed, and Ghost noted with satisfaction that the lawman's limp was barely noticeable now. "John's looking stronger," he observed. "Thanks to you," Sarah replied. "Thanks to his own strength," Ghost corrected. "All I did was remind him of it." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant coyote calls and the muted sounds from the saloon. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "I found something today going through the old storage room." She pulled a faded wanted poster from her pocket. From before. Ghost took it carefully. His own face stared back at him, younger, harder, eyes burning with a fire that had long since been banked to steady warmth. The reward listed was staggering, enough to set someone up for life. Still worth just as much, Sarah noted. The territorial governor never officially rescinded it. Ghost folded the poster carefully. "Worth more as a reminder, I think, of who I was, who I chose to be instead." He tucked it into his vest. "And who I might have become without the right people, showing me another way." The stranger emerged from the saloon, pausing when he saw them. He'd shed his trail coat, and with it the hard edge he'd arrived with. "Heading out?" Ghost asked. "No, sir," the man replied, and there was respect in his voice now, not challenge. "Thought I might stick around for a while. Mr. Kane mentioned you might be looking for help with the afternoon shift." Ghost exchanged a glance with Sarah. "Did he now?" "Said something about how the quietest places sometimes teach the loudest lessons." "Kane's gotten philosophical in his retirement," Ghost observed dryly, but his eyes were warm. "Ever worked at a bar before?" "No, sir, but I'm willing to learn about that and—" The stranger hesitated. "Other things." Ghost studied him for a long moment, seeing what others had once seen in him. The potential for change, the hunger for purpose beyond the gun. "First lesson," he said finally, "is learning to listen. Not just to words, but to what's behind." "You them think you can do that?" "Yes, sir, I mean—" The man caught himself. "Yes, Ghost." "Good. Come by tomorrow morning. Sarah will show you the ropes." As the man turned to leave, Ghost added softly, "And leave the gun at home. Only shooting we do here is straight talk and fair deals." After the stranger had gone, Sarah leaned against the porch rail. "Taking on another stray, like someone once took a chance on me?" Ghost's voice held gentle amusement. "Besides, wayword spreading about this place, we could use the help." As if to prove his point, a wagon train's worth of dust appeared on the horizon. Another group of travelers seeking rest, refreshment, and perhaps something more intangible. "They come for the legend," Sarah observed, "but stay for the truth." They come looking for the desert phantom," Ghost corrected, "but find something better, a place where men can put down their guns and pick up their humanity instead." Inside, Ruby struck up another song, this one older, a favorite that Catherine had once sung in another saloon, in another life. Ghost closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. The pain was still there, but it had transformed into something else, something that taught rather than tormented. "You still miss her," Sarah said softly. "Every day," Ghost agreed. "But now I can remember the lessons instead of just the loss. She saw the man I could be long before I did. Just like John saw the peace I could bring, not just the trouble I could cause." The evening stage rolled in, bringing with it new faces, new stories, new chances for redemption. Ghost watched as passengers descended, some already eyeing the saloon with that mix of curiosity and caution that had become familiar. "Back to work?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Always," Ghost replied, straightening his vest. "Peace doesn't keep itself." They returned inside, where the light and warmth drove back the desert night. Ghost resumed his place behind the bar, picking up a glass and his ever-present cloth. The motion was the same as it had been that fateful night a month ago, the same as it had been for 4 years before that. But now it carried a different meaning, not a shield to hide behind, but a bridge to help others cross from who they were to who they could become. "You know what Catherine would say about all this?" he said suddenly, surprising Sarah with the voluntary mention of that name. "What's that?" "She'd say that sometimes the best stories aren't about how fast a man can draw, but how completely he can change. That sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with bullets, but with patience and understanding." He looked around the saloon. At Kane teaching the stranger a quiet lesson about redemption, at Ruby singing her song of transformation, at Carson making his rounds with quiet dignity, at the newcomers learning that legends can become something better than mere stories. "And sometimes," Ghost finished softly, "the most dangerous thing in a room isn't the man who can kill you fastest, but the one who can show you how to truly live instead." The desert wind whispered outside, carrying now not threats but possibilities. In the dusty Spur saloon, the man who had once been the desert phantom continued his true calling, not dealing death, but pouring hope, one drink at a time, in a place where legends came to die and better truths rose to take their place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.